Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Using GED Program Tools to Meet WIOA Benchmarks webinar. Today's speaker, C.T. Turner, has worked on GED, workforce development, and adult education issues with GED Testing Service for 8 years. He currently serves as Senior Director of State Accounts and Government Relations and is responsible for leading the organization's State Relationship Management team, as well as the Government Relations and Public Affairs functions. CT is passionate about building bridges between adult education and the workforce, as well as transitions into college and career training programs. His position brings him into regular contact with adult education and training programs, workforce investment boards, chambers of commerce, major U.S. employers, state and national policymakers, and legislators from across the country. CT has served as a member of the Northern Virginia Workforce Development Board and is the GED Testing Service representative to the National Council for Literacy, the national advocacy organization for adult literacy. And now I'll turn it over to C.T. Turner.
Hello. Hi, my name is C.T. Turner, as Amber so politely pointed out. Thank you all for taking time to join us today. Good afternoon to half of you and good morning to the rest. I think this is an important and timely topic. I'm glad all of you are able to join us today, and I think we have a lot of content to delve into. Let me start here really quick by giving some background about the webinar we're going to have today. So first off, I just want to say, let's be clear that WIOA is a very, very expansive topic. There have been several multi-day conferences around the country dedicated to understanding the WIOA regs for state agency staff and for policymakers. And even then, the rules have taken almost 2 years to develop from the U.S. Department of Education and Labor and other agencies. And we still have some clarifications that are going to be forthcoming. So it's a pretty expansive topic. With that in mind, and then some of the details that we received back when you all registered and some of the information you provided, this is a 1-hour webinar, so we are going to gear it primarily to those who work in adult education and GED preparation programs. The majority of attendees reported to having limited to little knowledge about WIOA to date, so we want to make sure we keep the information at a good level, a high level, but still give you the details that we think are most important to you during this first conversation. While most of the information that we're talking about today and the resources are consistent across all states, the implementation of WIOA is going to vary a little bit depending on your particular state, as each state has unified state plans to govern the WIOA core programs. So we're going to talk today about WIOA, the basics, give you the things that we think are most important for you to know. We tried to weave in all of the questions you all submitted to answer those throughout the content of the webinar. And since we have an hour, we're going to try to do some Q&A at the end. We did try to answer as many questions as possible during writing the webinar, but we want to make sure that you all know that this is a continuing conversation. This is probably the first of many. So we are committed to answering your questions, whether those, and exploring these topics more, whether those be through webinars, FAQs, direct follow-ups, and other ways to continue this dialogue on WIOA. Just a couple of administrative items really quickly. We did mute the lines so that we don't have any background noise and everyone can hear all of the content from the webinar today. We do encourage you all to submit questions. If you look at your control panel, there should be a headline that says questions there. You can go ahead and type your questions in there. And again, we will follow up with them if we have time in the webinar and then after, and use that to develop new content moving forward. So go ahead and do that. And then lastly, there will be an evaluation and a couple questions to continue this dialogue that will pop up automatically at the end of the webinar. So we really appreciate you taking 2 minutes to do that at the very end of the webinar. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So part 1, what you should know about WIOA. So there are sort of 6 broad goals, I would say, to WIOA in terms of what legislation was passed, the authors of the legislation, those who provided testimony when it was written. There's a certain set of goals that we were trying to, or not we, that lawmakers were trying to accomplish when they passed the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. And so the first one of those goals is to increase access to education, training, and employment, particularly for people with barriers to employment. And there are things buried within the regulations that really point to this particular thing for really helping those who have barriers to employment. Secondly, it's to create a comprehensive, high-quality workforce development system by aligning workforce investment, education, and economic development. Adult education is a key component, obviously, as you can see, but it's only one leg of the tripod in terms of implementing an effective and meaningful workforce development system. And so that means the spirit of the legislation and the regulations are for collaboration and partnership in order to make sure that this workforce investment system is truly effective. 3, to improve the quality of labor market relevance of workforce investment, education, and economic development efforts. And 4, promote improvement in the structure and delivery of services of those things within that system. 5, to increase the prosperity of workers and employers. And then finally, reduce welfare dependency, increase economic self-sufficiency, meet employer needs in the local communities, and enhance the productivity and competitiveness of the nation. So not small goals set forth when WIOA was passed. And so in order to make this happen, and again, as I pointed to a little bit ago, the legislation's intent really is to have collaboration and cooperation through programs. And so it really requires all of these federal agencies to work more closely than ever in modern times to improve the nation's workforce development system. It's really critical to our nation's competitiveness, and then also to create those better outcomes for adult learners, especially those who are vulnerable and disengaged. I personally have never seen particularly DOL and DOE specifically working so closely than they have over the past 2 years. Johan Uven at Octay and someone from labor are often on panels, and they often joke about spending more time with their counterparts in different agencies than they do with their spouses sometimes. And at different parts of them writing the regulations, I'm sure that was probably true. But that's great news, because I remember going over to labor, having a conversation with them, and it really being a silo, then going over to Octay and the Department of Education, having that same conversation, and there being a silo there. So it's really great to see that cooperation and collaboration thus far in terms of implementing WIOA. All right, so I wanted to take a minute to talk about the basics. So what's all this talk and terminology about titles or titled programs? It's something people throw around a lot at conferences, and I feel like sometimes we just don't want to ask the question, you know, what does that person really mean? Or, hey, I know what this means, but not everyone knows what this means. So as you explore this a little bit further, you're probably going to hear people talk about titles. So I wanted to take a couple minutes and just spell these out. So there are a few titles here we'll talk about. So Title I, it's the primary source of federal workforce development funding to prepare low-income adults, youth, and dislocated workers for employment and to help them continue to build skills once they are employed. And then Title II, you all will be more familiar with. Title II is the main source of federal adult education and literacy funding, including English language services. So that's Title I, that's Title II. Title III is referred to as Wagner-Pfizer Employment Services, and that is those services or things that covered under Title III provide labor exchange services that match employers with qualified job seekers. So that really is employment services. And then finally, Title IV funds vocational rehabilitation, or voc rehab, which supports a wide variety of services designed to help individuals with disabilities prepare for and engage in gainful employment, secure financial and personal independence through rehabilitative services. So now that we have the high-level basics out of the way, what are the goals of WIOA? What are these titles? What are some of the acronyms? Just a small scratch in terms of the surface of all of the acronyms that are out there. But what are the things that you most likely want to know? What are the key changes that you should know about from where we were with WIA moving over to WIOA? And so I would say primarily WIOA maintains the same basic structure that WIA had in terms of, you know, occupational training title, adult education, all those different titled things that we just talked about. All of those are still included and sort of named the same way, same conventions under WIOA as they were in WIA. So there's many things that are the same, but there are many, many things that are pretty dramatically different in some areas. And so I wanted to point some of those out. So first, the legislation mandates unified state plans for all of those core programs that we just talked about. These state plans need to describe the state's overall strategy for workforce development and how the strategy will meet identified skilled needs for workers, job seekers, and employers. These local plans, they must be aligned to the strategy described in the state plans. It must describe how services provided at the local level will be aligned to regional labor market needs. And so there's a high focus on the states coordinating all of these services and implementing WIOA and doing that under a unified state plan. And so when we talked earlier on about some variation in terms of how this was going to be implemented in your state, that's what I was referring to as these unified state plans, where some things in the margins and somewhere in the middle will really be governed a little bit differently or implemented differently in the states, although the regulations are the same and the outcome measurements and those sort of things will remain the same as well. The second major thing is, excuse me, we're moving to common measures across all of the core programs for both occupational and adult, so youth and adult programs. So that's a little bit different from where we were in WIOA. It also calls for greater transparency and tracking of measures and outcomes. And so that's a recurring theme you're going to hear often when people are talking about WIOA. It also requires new state operation and evaluation and improvement of one-stops. So WIOA requires state boards to establish criteria for use by local boards to assess the effectiveness, physical, and programmatic accessibility and continuous improvement of American job centers at least every 3 years. So the bill maintains current requirements for mandatory one-stop partners to reach a voluntary agreement to fund infrastructure costs. So this is something pretty different than what most places were operating at under WIOA. However, if local areas fail to come up with an agreement, a state-mandated funding mechanism may be imposed upon those local areas. So those of you that are having conversations about funding one-stops, and again, this is something that's pretty dramatically different and something many of you were not really expected or participating in before. Just a tip is in-kind services that you all provide can and should be counted towards those contributions to funding one-stops. Next thing is WIOA mandates sanctions. And so it could reduce funding for states not reporting or meeting approved performance measures or outcomes. So that's something that's also pretty different. So in essence, there is some teeth in the legislation that if states are not reporting or they're not meeting their benchmark outcomes that have been approved, then there could be sanctions and reduced funding that comes along with that. The last thing I have on this slide is employment and training activities. And so those of you that were familiar with sequence of services, that meant that people that came into a one-stop really could take advantage of the services only in a certain sequence of ways. They had to do X, Y, Z first, then they had to move on to B, and then they had to move on to C. Well, that really is all combined, and those intensive services are now in a new category called career services. So that allows a lot more flexibility in the one-stops to do some things contextualized and do some things in not a sequence that's being dictated at a high level. So it allows more flexibility. And I know when I was working with the Northern Virginia Workforce Development Board, they took full advantage of that, and they were trying some things out even before the regulations were coming down. So I think that will be really helpful. And I think there are lots of things here where adult education can be creative and can be thoughtful and really be thought leaders in this piece. And especially when we're talking about doing all these things so that we're looking to local industry and we're seeing what job sectors are growing in your local community, what they're paying, where there's a need for new workers. And so that's a great spot, obviously, for our adult learners to be looking towards for career pathways to make sure that they're on a good pathway to employment and earning a sustainable living wage. So those are the big key changes. And then just to talk about these indicators, if you look on the left here, these are the common measures as they were called under WIOA. So all of these things were measurements across, they weren't all the same. All the core programs didn't have these same measures. And so that changes under WIOA. And all of these primary indicators, or many of these primary indicators, more of the primary indicators, really apply to both adult and youth programs. And so the key things that you're going to be hearing about under these indicators that are a little bit different than probably what you were experiencing under WIOA is, one, employment. So employment is super important. At 6 months or the second quarter, after exiting an adult education program, earning a GED credential or some kind of milestone, they will be looking at whether they are gainfully employed at that time. So at 6 months, they're going to look and see if folks are employed, and that will count towards the metrics. Same thing for youth programs. And then the other thing is to look at a year out and see if they're employed as well. Then the other key thing to be looking at here is education. So are folks at 6 months in higher education or some kind of credentialing, post-secondary credentialing certificate program, and the same thing a year out. So if they earn credentials, they enrolled at a year out. So those are really important, those outcomes. So not just earning a credential, but going on into the workforce, being gainfully employed, or going on into post-secondary credentialing certificate or degree programs and being enrolled or earning credentials. And then also, effectiveness in serving employers is something that's going to be measured, and that's something that really wasn't taken into strong account, I think, in WIOA. It was just suggested, but WIOA really goes out of its way to say that local workforce investment boards and all these programs really need to cooperate, and they need to have a good dialogue, but they also need to be thinking about serving employers in their local communities to make sure that there's alignment between the workforce system and then where these folks are going and the jobs that are available in their local communities. So what other things should you all know besides the basics, the big picture things about WIOA, the titles, the core measures that we just talked about, or performance metrics that we just talked about? So Title II is something, so this is adult education. There is a greater emphasis on adult education programs. It gives higher emphasis to, I'd say, a redefined role. So more college and job readiness services, those types of things, distance learning, comprehensive planning, and inclusion of business leaders and representatives, and then also adult education on local workforce investment boards. So I think that there's a lot of room for leadership and collaborative thinking, and ways to really engage other partners and really show off, I think, what adult education can do. And so that's a big benefit and a change, I think, in the legislation from the strict sort of writing of WIOA and the role of adult education. So there's a bigger role. It's acknowledged in WIOA. Time for us to step up to the plate and really take on that role, I think, and show value of adult education. As different in WIOA to WIOA, there was no funding really designated in WIOA. That's not true necessarily, although things always change. There are some funding levels that are named under WIOA. I think the unfortunate thing, obviously, is even though adult education is given greater prominence, I think, and the ability to do more, or looking to adult education to do some more in workforce development, there is an expansive amount of dollars coming to adult education. So that's the catch-22, I think, of that one. All right, what else? So states are required to open a competition for adult education programs, also for one-stops, to award funds. And so that means if you haven't heard, you're probably going to hear, or someone in your programs will be involved some way in this. And so it's saying that there needs to be some kind of competition, so like RFP, RFI, whatever the state may call it, competition where programs will have to submit their plans, what services they're offering, and then what the proposed metrics are, things along those lines, so that there can be an evaluation, and then they can actually award funds and acknowledge programs based on those competitions. And then I think for the first time nationally, although this happened a little bit maybe in local pockets, the first time nationally under WIOA, it's dictated that the Workforce Development or Workforce Investment Boards, or WIBs, will review and comment on local adult education programs. And so I think some folks were trepidatious about this, saying, what do Workforce Investment Boards know about adult education? And the answer to that is varies. Some are really well informed, have great partners, they have good representation on their WIB. And then there are some that just never really, some don't do a lot at all, but some really don't do much at all with adult education. So I think it really behooves any of you that are involved, or your program folks who are involved in these conversations with local workforce investment boards, to really cue that conversation up. There's some resources out there to really prepare them for the conversation, get them up to speed on what adult education does. And I would say, don't be afraid to call on your colleagues in your state or call upon your state agency staff and leaderships to help you navigate those conversations if you're running into any kind of difficulty. I think this is also one of those opportunities for engagement with local workforce investment boards if there hasn't been engagement. It's a great time to educate them about all the great things and services that adult education provides and does for adult learners. And then also a bit of time for advocacy too, to talk about all the great things that adult education can and are doing. What other things here? So I can't stress this one enough. Credentials and education milestones aren't enough. They're super important under WIOA, but they aren't enough. And in the words of, what's that, Jerry, show me the money. WIOA, I would say, is show me the outcomes. So employability, employment, and post-secondary progress and attainment are, significantly more important measures under WIOA than they were under WIA. And then the last note, I think, on this one is states will really need to work hard. Some states are in a better position than others on this, but they're really going to have to align their data systems or create new ways to track data across agencies, because those measures, again, will really be required to look at individual data and show that someone was, in one of these core programs or in adult education, let's say, earned a GED credential. Then are they employed at 4 months? Are they employed at, 6 months? They employed a year. Same thing for post-secondary. And then it also asks for average wage information and some other things and employer engagement. So those are things that are really going to be stressed, but they're going to require some work in terms of states cooperating across agencies. And so again, I think this is another place where some of the data tools that are available and some of the information that you all have will help inform some of these conversations. And there may be some data that's helpful to share if you're in a, testing side with adult education. If you're in a state that doesn't have much involvement specifically with the testing centers, they may have access to overarching data that's really important for adult education to see in order to understand how the programs are doing, how students are doing on the test, and provide any feedback that might be helpful to improving anything that's going on. So data is super important. At the same time, the rub in that one is there's been a lot of legislation and conversation about data privacy. So that's something that will make it a little bit more difficult, I think, to navigate, but states will still be required to do that in order to take advantage of this large amount of funding that will be coming to fund adult education and these other core programs. So what are the opportunities? So you're probably sitting there saying, wow, this is making my head spin, or okay, this is interesting, but how does it affect me? It sounds like a lot of new regulations or new things that I'm going to have to learn about are going to be put back on my programs, but what opportunities are there for me? And I think it's really important for us to think about those opportunities and not think of this as, this is sort of the letter of the law. I think it's important to think about the spirit of the law. So what's great about WIOA? I think first off, I would say that legislators did, reauthorize this, and they're saying that it's important, and an effective workforce development system is super important to the country. It's important to economic competitiveness. It's important to individuals who are disengaged, who are vulnerable, who are disconnected from the education and workforce pipeline. That's super important, and you all are doing yeoman's work in terms of really helping those folks. I think it's also an opportunity to have some really deeper, or to have deeper conversations, really do some planning in collaboration with partner programs to serve adult learners effectively. So when I was talking about the role of adult education, instead of thinking of it in a one-stop as a discrete silo, you go do this, you go do this, you get your check mark, you go do this thing, to really think about how to integrate some of those things, because people's lives aren't in silos. Lives are messy. and lots of things are going on. So really thinking about that and thinking about how we could really do things a little bit differently, how we can sequence things differently, how we can collaborate and cooperate. I think it's a real opportunity to step up and really show the value of adult education and how much we know about these folks. I think it's a great time to show good partnership and use some of those innovative thinkings to really show off the value of adult education. And then I think it's a good opportunity, as I said, to inform and educate local partners and also workforce investment and development boards. And I think this is a great time to have real conversations with the labor side of the house. I can't tell you how many times I've overheard folks in labor, or just they've told me, oh, those education folks are going to drag down our metrics, right? They take too long, they're really concerned about credentials, they're really not concerned about employment. And then on the other side, I hear folks in adult education say, oh, those labor folks, they just churn them through. They don't give them the basic skills that they necessarily need. They just want to get them in a job so that they can check that box, not caring if they're employed, in another month, much less 6 months or 12 months. There may be some truth in both of those, but overall, I don't think that's necessarily true. And this is the time to really put that to the test and really collaborate and cooperate so that adult learners are really getting the full advantage of what the system and all of the different things we're providing really can do for that. So part 2, I wanted to take some time to talk about and highlight some of the GED program tools that I think can help you with some of these things with WIOA implementation. So you have all these things, all these ideas, all these things that are going to be coming down through the state plans to be thinking about, well, what things are we doing at GED Testing Service, or what's already available to you that can help you do some of these types of things that we've been talking about. So I just created a quick checkbox here. So here are some of the key things. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list. I think there are many other things, but I think here are kind of the big picture, high-value things that are really going to be helpful in terms of being WIOA-focused and really being prepared for that implementation. So first, I would say the test, it being aligned to the OCTAE or USDOE college and career readiness standards. That's super important. And we've done that evaluation, and that crosswalk's been available for years, available on the website. I think that's super important because we can't hope to get folks in jobs and get folks into post-secondary credential and certificate programs unless we have a test, and then the preparation is really helping align to that and more to really prepare those folks to go on and be successful and enter into both of those pathways. Also, I think it's super helpful that the test also certifies readiness for credit-bearing college courses and possibly even college credit. I think that cannot be overstated. I think that's super exciting. Work is definitely important. Many adult learners will earn their credential and go on to get a job without enrolling in credentialing programs. Many of them, however, will come back and need to have education and some certification or certificate in order to go on and really have the jobs that they want to have. So really preparing them for that to be successful. And if we can give them a jump start on that, I think that's incredible. We also have tools for better data to understand what's happening in preparation, adult education in terms of their performance on GED tests and such, and then also their progress after. So data matching, things that we're doing on that front as well, research. Tools to increase understanding of career and education pathways. Talk a little bit more about that, but having people on a pathway and motivated and looking past the test, not just, it's a hoop they have to jump through and not an endpoint, I think is critically important as well. And then really opening their eyes about what's available in their local community in terms of jobs. I think that's really important, and so those tools are important as well. And then collaboration and partnerships with employers. That is really important, not just because we think it's important. It's really important because the federal lawmakers and WIOA and the regulations have said it's important, right? So they've said you have to have meaningful conversations, you have to have these cooperations with employers, and I think there are side benefits for adult education also in what we do in that arena. So to jump to the first thing here, those multiple measures or multiple performance measures on the GED test, I just want to remind everyone that we do have the passing level or passing and high school equivalency level of 145. So that is an indicator that that student has skills and knowledge on par with the typical high school graduate. And that's where many of our folks will land in that 145 to 165 range. Secondly, we have the GED College Ready level at 165, and that indicates that a student is demonstrating readiness for credit-bearing college coursework in that subject. And then the third, or the highest level at 175, the recommendation there is, or what that says, that it indicates students are demonstrating college-level skills and knowledge. And so we just had some data back right before our conference here in August or so, where we're looking at performance on the GED test, especially as we changed the pass score about a year ago. What effect has that had on where people are landing in scores? So is everyone scoring now from 145 to 150? And the answer to that, thankfully, is no. And what we're really seeing is growth in all of these different categories. So we have growth from 145 to 165, we have growth from 165 to 175, and 175 and above. So what does that mean? That means students are doing better on their tests, they're becoming more comfortable with the content in the test itself. Adult educators and programs are definitely effectively preparing folks for the GED test as demonstrated by their performance in those different levels. So that's great news. So I want to take a minute and talk about the College Ready and College Ready Plus credit levels, as that post-secondary piece at 6 months and 12 months is super important in the WIOA regulations in terms of metrics. And so the College Ready and College Ready Plus credit scores are based on recommendations from the ACE Credit Recommendation Program. Many, if not most, of all of your colleges in almost every state are part of the ACE Credit Network and already participate in some kind of ACE credit, whether through military programs, corporate programs, you name it. There's an expansive network of folks who are involved in that, and colleges that participate. And so I think that's a ready-made pipeline. There's some familiarity at institutions, although they may not think of the ACE credit program as really working with the GED program. So I think that's a bit of a sea change and a mental shift for folks. But I do want to make sure that you all know that the ACE Credit Recommendation Program is expansive, has a long history, and it's the same organization that also evaluates things like advanced placement or AP courses and CLEP courses, things that are really commonplace in many institutions of higher ed across the country. So I think there's some great benefits also of College Ready and College Ready Plus credit. I touched on those a little bit ago. But if we have roughly 1 in 4 students already reaching college ready level in at least one subject, that says some great things, and I think we can do some great things with that. One of the numbers that I kind of live with every day is about 70% of our test takers for the last couple of decades have said they want to go on to some kind of career, or they want a job that's going to require some education or training after they earn a GED credential. But too few of them were actually earning some kind of certification or certificate or degree after 7 years. That's beginning to change, and change, I think, pretty rapidly, as I'll show you here in just a few minutes. But this is really important to fast forward education, that bridge to education. So that means at the college ready level, the recommendation is that a student bypass the placement exam in that subject, and then also be put directly into credit-bearing college courses. So they're not stuck in a developmental education course with not earning a credit towards a certification that particular semester while they still have childcare, they've taken out financial aid, they have transportation, they have to issues they have to solve. If we can get them there quicker, that fast forwards them. And then if we can get colleges to start accepting the College Ready Plus credit, which a few already are, that can really fast forward, I think, the efficacy there and really get adult learners money in their pocket, time in their pocket, and a lot of momentum towards earning a certification. So there is momentum in adoption of the College Ready and College Ready Plus credit levels. I'm sure you all are interested in that. So there are, I don't know, probably 60 campuses in one university system that is using the College Ready recommendation. There are other college systems, state systems that are in evaluation. Some are using it at some colleges as a pilot, and we'll be rolling it out later. There are a host of institutions that aren't part of a system that are using the College Ready recommendation. And then there are several state systems that are actively examining this. States like Ohio, Texas, you name it. Many states are in evaluation of the planning process of looking at these or adopting the College Ready recommendation. So that's really important. We also know that there are some institutions that have already started awarding college credit. So the latest I think I've heard was Kent State University in Ohio was awarding college credit to a student who reached that higher 175 level on one of his test subjects. And so how can you assist in this one? Because I think this one is very important. As we pointed out earlier, I was just at a conference and there was a local metro area that, there were thousands of jobs in IT that just required a certification that were available and paid extremely, extremely well above the median pay in that area. And all it took was, 9-month certificate or something like that. So these types of things can be really valuable, I think, to adult learners. And so if you can, in order to assist, you can actually ask your local college if they've adopted or are evaluating these recommendations. If not, you can give them some information. You can ask them consider doing so. We're more than happy to have conversations. We're doing that often with different institutions and different systems to provide information about both of those levels. And then I wanted to talk quickly about data. And so data tracking, super important, as I talked about in WIOA. And so we put some things in place, and really, I think the bedrock, besides the test of the GED program, new GED program has really been on data, how to use data, how to give folks access to data so that they can use that and really determine progress. So what's happening? What could we tweak? What could we do differently or better to serve adult learners? And we use that data often in terms of tweaking things that we're doing on GED.com. You name it. We use that data often, and I think that's super important to be able to look at that at sort of a meta level and really make those tweaks. And so some of the things that we've provided as far as data goes is the GED score report. So if you'll remember before the new program, folks didn't know, once a student went in, took the tests, they didn't really know what they needed to remediate on. They really had no idea. They either didn't pass by a lot or they didn't pass by a little. And you were sort of, unless they had a teacher that had been working with them, it was really hard to go back and pinpoint quickly what they needed remediation on and what they already had mastered. So the score report really provides a lot more information. And if they're not in an adult education program, they take a GED Ready, and then they're prompted, if they don't pass that or score in the green, they're prompted to say, hey, did you know you have a local resource and local adult education program in your local community? They can share their scores and they can provide that score information to teachers who can then look at that and really kind of focus and help them, and help them focus with them on a learning plan to really get them over that hump and really be prepared to perform on the GED test. And then also those score reports are linked to publisher materials. So that is pretty dramatically different, I think, than what we've had in the past as well. Also, GED analytics is very important. That is state level data. It's used. It's used by states. It's available in real time. If you think back to the old world, in 2013, there was a once a year report that came out, which was usually 6 months old, had some interesting data, but a lot can change in 6 months. If you just think about the Great Recession, what happened in 6 months at any particular period of time, you can see how much things can change. So that data is super important being available in real time. It's also at the fingertips of folks in the States so that they can look at that data, not just in real time, but they have a larger breadth and depth of data. So they can really look at performance on individual tests in their state. They can look at particular areas. They can look at demographic information. They can see who's scoring at College Ready, what test subjects they're scoring in College Ready, how people are scoring on the GED Ready test. There's a whole myriad of information that's available that wasn't available before. And that allows us to query that data in real time. It also allows state folks to look at that and create dashboards to really monitor how things are going. And so I think that's been super important. I think that's also been helping to pinpoint professional development. So we do a lot of work in professional development in collaboration and coordination with the states. And we do a lot of conferences locally, regionally, and nationally. And that's helped us to pinpoint that where students might be struggling or where the common sort of sore spots are, so that we can focus professional development, and we can produce things like most frequently missed question types or item types or subjects. And so that's super important. Another thing that we've just launched, let's see, a month and a half ago is GED Prep Connect. And so GED Prep Connect's a new tool that helps make local GED preparation and adult education programs much more visible to adult learners. So we have millions of adult learners who have accounts on GED.com. They come on there, they poke around. Some of them are ready to take a test. Some of them are looking for prep material. Some of them are just looking where to start. And so we wanted to make sure at multiple points in their GED.com experience that we were highlighting the availability and the value of adult education programs. We know that students are more effective when they have someone in their corner. When they have a teacher, they have that local resource. That's super important for many adult learners. So we want to make sure that we were highlighting that. So when a student signs up for an account, when they take a GED Ready test, when they take a GED, when they take a GED Ready, or when they take the actual test, and several other points, when they're getting information back, they're proactively prompted to select an adult education center. We promote those programs, they get that information, and then they can share their scores. And so Share My Scores is an important part of GED Prep Connect. I think since we've launched that in middle of October, almost 25,000 students have already shared their scores with a local adult education program. So we know that that's a valuable tool, and that will increase in value. Almost all states are using Share My Scores. A couple large states have either just come on or just about to come on. And I think that's a super valuable tool, and that goes hand in hand with GED Prep Connect. The other piece to GED Prep Connect is changes and enhancement we made to GED Manager to really help local programs better recruit, kind of get leads for local adult learners to recruit them into their programs to take advantage of your all services and programs. It also provides them resources to better manage students, to do things like print out score reports in a batch so that someone in the office can print those out and give them to teachers for all their students. So there's several things that we've done on that piece that I think are super valuable as well. And then on the career exploration piece, we have PathSource, which is a free tool that's integrated into GED.com. It's free for anyone who wants to use it. I think it's helpful for students, but it's also helpful for educators and program staff. So as you'll remember, employability and employment are sort of guiding principles or key metrics in WIOA, and they're key benchmarks that are going to be measured. And so really focusing on these career pathways, employability is super important. We've learned through research that students have shallow or kind of little knowledge of the career pathways, and then specifically what careers are growing and are available in their local communities. I can't tell you the number of times I've been talking with folks in adult ed programs, and they say, one after one, people will come into my program, ask them what they want to do, and they want to be a CNA, or whatever sort of the occupation du jour is, just based upon word of mouth, who they've heard from their friends. And that might be a valuable pathway, but there may be 10 more valuable pathways, or maybe things that will earn them more money, will require less time in terms of additional post-secondary certification or education. So it's really important, I think, to do that. PathSource is super easy to use. If you haven't done it, I encourage you to do so. There's a quick assessment that someone fills out. It's a very easy, friendly thing to do. It spits out some things that they think match based on your responses. There are hundreds of thousands of videos out there. Excuse me, I should probably say tens of thousands of videos out there of people in these actual jobs, real short videos, up to 3 minutes or so, where someone's telling you about what they do in that occupation. Then also it provides information about the availability of those jobs, what the outlook looks like, and say, if you're in Missouri, what does the outlook for that occupation look like? And then also, what does it pay compared to the national average? And so you get that sort of information. I think PathSource is also a valuable tool when we're thinking about WIOA and getting folks on the right pathway and understanding what their path might look like to employability and post-secondary education. And then another thing I want to talk about here is that employer engagement piece. Is that something that we've pointed out as being something identified under the WIOA legislation? And so some of you, if not most of you, may have heard of this program. We launched this almost a year ago. And this program really was aimed to look at that employer engagement. We partnered with Walmart, Taco Bell, KFC Foundation, and Southwestern Grocers, which has Winn-Dixie, Harvey's, and BI-LO, to partner with them to create a program. And so this program is fully subsidized by employers, and it provides all of the things a student would need to be successful monetarily, to be successful to take and to prepare for and take the GED test. So if they're an employer of any of these companies, they haven't had their high school diploma, which I think is a surprising number to most folks. We know that employers have spent time and energy on developing scholarship programs and pathways to get their workers into post-secondary programs. But once they started to realize just how many of their workers don't have a high school diploma, maybe even up to 1 in 3 or more in some of these companies, more in many, do not have a high school diploma, they can't take advantage of those programs until they have basic adult education, those basic skills and a basic credential. They need that GED credential in order to move up to a manager, to do whatever they're going to do, whether they move somewhere else and pursue some other career pathway. That's super important. And so employers are fully subsidizing this. It includes a GED advisor, access to online preparation materials, connection to local adult education programs, free GED readies, free GED tests, and then many of them provide incentives when students pass their test as well. So that's, I think, very important, an important program. And there will be more employers are going to be joining here later this year into early 2017. And so I think there's a couple benefits here to the GED Works program. One, it is subsidized by, or excuse me, it's really paid for by employers. And so there are potentially hundreds of thousands adult learners across the country that are able to take advantage of this. And just recently, Walmart announced that they're expanding the program to family members of Walmart associates. And so definitely hundreds of thousands of adult learners who have access to this program that are out there. So I think that's a ready-made group of folks we can get into our programs to really get them re-engaged who are disengaged from adult education and education pipeline. The other thing I think that's a benefit here is folks that are employed are logically more likely to be employed at 6 months in a year. So again, this is another tie to those WIOA metrics for the states as well. This is also a really huge, although first significant investment or partnership with large employers into GED preparation and adult education programs. And so employers spend more on education and training dollars than the federal government and state governments combined. So it makes sense to get employers engaged and then see if we can get some of those resources that they have available to really help these adult learners take advantage of these programs. The other thing too is I would say in your local programs, you can use GED Works to help recruit students. So when someone is inquiring about GED preparation programs, adult education programs, I think it's a great resource to say, hey, do you work for one of these employers, or does one of your family members if they're working at Walmart? I think that can help pull some folks into local programs. And then I think we can talk to folks already enrolled in our adult education programs to see if they qualify, because again, it just provides them some free preparation, free GED readies and free GED tests that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And then I think it's really important also to talk about that program locally. You can talk with your local Walmart, you can talk with some of these other employers in your local community and talk to them about what adult education provides besides just this GED Works program. And local policymakers and elected officials love anything that have to do with local employers. So it's a way for you to tie yourself to a major employer in your local community. So I didn't want to let this opportunity slip away, because I think this is super important information to give to you all that is sort of hot off the presses. And so I know that we had talked about the program when we launched in 2014 about a goal of really preparing adult learners better for the workforce, to really go out and get a job that they were satisfied with after earning their credential, to stay employed, then also be able to either re-entry back into the education pipeline for certification or certificates or degrees, or go right from a GED prep program into post-secondary. And so we wanted to really look at that and really measure those outcomes and show that progress, not just as something we stated and that we wanted to accomplish together in 2013 before we launched the new program, but really evaluate that and show that there's proof in the pudding and really make sure that it's delivering on those things. And so we have a pretty aggressive and I think expansive research agenda. We're doing cohort studies, surveys, you name it, lots of different sort of research touch points. But the most recent data that's come back is from a data match with the National Student Clearinghouse. This is where all student records go for post-secondary in terms of the degree attainment, if they're enrolled, all of those sorts of things. And so we submitted about 40,000 GED graduates in that match. Those were folks that we did in a match a year ago, plus a random sample of some other 2014 GED graduates. And we wanted to see what the results were. And so there are three things that overarching all of our research, but were just, again, reinforced through this recent data match. And so number one, a higher percentage of GED graduates are enrolling in post-secondary certificate, credentialing, and degree programs. That's super important because as we talked about that 75 number of folks wanting a career that was going to require that, and then the number that earned that was pretty dramatically different. We're definitely dramatically narrowing that gap since launch of the new program. Secondly, this was an, for me at least, unexpected result or consequence, is they're actually enrolling more rapidly. So once they earn that GED credential, there was a longer sort of cooling off or stopping period before they took that first step to enroll in some kind of certificate or credentialing program. They're doing it much more quickly, often the very first semester that they're eligible to do so after earning a GED credential. And so again, we know that anything that slows them down or stops them out dramatically increases their likelihood of not following through on that particular thing because life gets in the way. So if we can keep them moving, all the better. So this is a great result. And then another, I won't say unintended, but surprising thing for me is that they're performing well in credit-bearing college courses, but the persistence is very, very high. Over 90% of them are re-enrolling. So they've gone, they're enrolling faster, they enroll in that first semester of post-secondary. You know, the vast majority of them, most of them are re-enrolling for another semester. And then of the 7% that were no longer enrolled after a semester or a year, or after we look at both of these data matches a year later, 80% of them had already received some sort of certification or credential. So these folks weren't dropping out and didn't have something in hand. They were actually not in post-secondary, but they had already received something. And I think that's another really great source of sort of great data point for us to use and think about what's happening. And it really, you know, the credit really goes to you all, goes to adult educators who have really become comfortable with the content, who are really stepping up to the plate and really preparing these adult learners for what comes next. And that's really starting to show. So what were the key takeaways from part two? So we have multiple tools that will help your programs be even more effective in preparing adult learners and really preparing them for those next steps that we just had talked about in those outcomes piece. Learners in GED track programs, due to the hard work of you all, as I just said, are better positioned to be prepared for successful employment in post-secondary entry programs and then also progress in post-secondary or in employment. And then lastly, I just want to stress this one, we want to be your partners in making you all successful and making adult learners successful. So we're going to continue to explore new tools. We're going to continue to have conversations with you to see what we can do to better ourselves and be more effective in serving you and serving adult learners. And I think the latest result of that was GED Prep Connect. And we knew it, but we had heard, you know, from you all pretty often and loudly that we need to make sure that we're promoting local adult education programs on GED.com and wherever we can. And so we really took that to heart. We had lots of conversations with adult educators across the country, several rounds. And I think we went above and beyond what, you know, the original ask was there, and I think that's just an acknowledgement of what we want to do in terms of partnering with adult education to make you all successful and really make adult learners successful. So I did have a couple resources here, 2 slides. I won't give these to you because if you look on your control panel on the left or wherever it is on your screen, there is a call out or a headline that says handouts. If you click on that arrow to go down, there's a PDF of all of these slides where you can download this information, and I'm sure it will be available somewhere else after this webinar as well. And then we also provided GED GED program resources there as well. So I think these are the key things that we had talked about, or I think places you would want to go to get the most important information from the website. So that brings us to the conclusion of the webinar. I know it was fast and furious and we had a lot of information to get through. If I could again encourage you all just to take a couple more minutes right when your webinar stops to answer the survey. We want to make sure that, again, we answered your questions, or we're going to answer any questions that you have. We want to make sure that this is the first of our dialogue and this is a continual dialogue. We know this is a broad and deep topic. So we want to find out what questions you all still have and then where there are common areas that we want to explore deeper in this subject. You know, we're committing to additional webinars, FAQs, whatever we can do to really keep the conversation moving and really engage with you all in good dialogue around WIOA. So thank you all for joining us in the conversation today. I trust this was fruitful first foray into WIOA. And again, we have a good continued dialogue, and I wish everyone a safe and happy holiday season. Thank you.